Just days before Labor Day, Thomas Bellamy finds a printed HOA warning zip-tied to his fence. Unauthorized technical unit near public frontage, subject to removal. The paper flaps slightly in the morning breeze, its bold red lettering standing out against the weathered cedar pickets. Thomas stared at it for a moment before reaching up to unfasten the zip tie. The plastic strip gave way with a snap. He studied the notice, then looked toward the small gray box sitting a few feet from the sidewalk, barely the size of a lunch cooler, nestled among the marigolds. It hadn't moved an inch in 3 years. He let out a quiet sigh, folded the paper, and slipped it into the back pocket of his jeans. As he turned, the sound of an electric motor whined softly behind him. He didn't have to look. He already knew that hum. Karen Holloway rolled past in her cream-colored HOA golf cart, her posture upright, like someone preparing to issue a citation at any moment. She slowed just enough to make eye contact, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other clutching a clipboard. Her sunglasses hid whatever expression she wore, but her voice rang out clear as ever. "That tech junk doesn't belong in a heritage town," she said, not stopping, just passing judgment on the breeze. Thomas offered a polite nod that didn't quite reach his eyes. She kept moving, the cart trundling off toward the next house down. After she was gone, he walked back inside, moving through the familiar stillness of his home. The scent of old wood and coffee grounds drifted through the air. He passed a framed photo near the kitchen, a younger version of himself standing beside a proud, silver-haired man in front of a relay station, both in matching polos that read Heartland Broadband Co-op. His father had started it decades ago, one of the first rural ISPs in Missouri. Thomas had taken it over quietly after retiring from his job as a network engineer out west. He never advertised who he was. That was never the point. He poured himself a fresh cup and stepped onto the back porch. The morning sun painted the tops of the trees with a golden hue. A pair of mourning doves cooed lazily from the power line overhead. He thought of how his father had once said, "Connection isn't about speed, it's about people feeling less alone." Thomas had taken that to heart. It's why he kept the little gray box running, his father's legacy project, as he liked to call it, even if no one else knew who kept Elderbrook online. Later that morning, Thomas walked to Evergreen Diner, same as he did every Friday. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in, the scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee hanging comfortably in the air. Francine waved him to his usual booth near the window. He slid into the vinyl seat, nodding politely at the older couple across from him, who were deep in conversation about their tomatoes getting sun-scalded. At the corner table, a small group of retirees were talking louder than usual. "Wi-Fi cut out again last night," one said, shaking his head. "I couldn't get the bingo scores from my daughter." "Same here," another chimed in. "Tried to order my cholesterol meds, but the website froze." Thomas sipped his coffee and didn't say anything. He made a mental note to run a diagnostic later. Something felt off. Just as he was getting up to leave, Mailman Joe popped in to grab a breakfast sandwich. He spotted Thomas and paused at his booth. "Hey, Bellamy," Joe said, lowering his voice. "Karen's on a tear again. Said something at the HOA meeting about removing any structures that disrupt curb-line visual symmetry. Sounded like she had your place in mind." Thomas forced a half smile. Appreciate the heads up. When he returned home, his inbox had already pinged twice. A forwarded email from Richard, the HOA secretary, and another from Karen. The subject line read, "Reminder, compliance sweep before Labor Day festivities." Inside, a highlighted paragraph instructed residents to remove or report non-decorative structures along any curb-facing property line to preserve neighborhood aesthetics. He rubbed his temple slowly. It wasn't the first time Karen had weaponized language to suit her goals, but this one struck closer than usual. Mid-afternoon, Thomas was in the garage checking the backup battery units when he noticed two figures in matching polos standing by the sidewalk. One held a measuring tape, the other jotted notes on a clipboard. He stepped out quietly, not saying anything at first. The younger of the two looked up, startled. The older man cleared his throat. "Mr. Bellamy?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "We're with HOA maintenance, doing pre-festival inspection." "You're measuring my fiber node," Thomas said flatly. The younger one shifted awkwardly. "We were told it might be a tripping hazard, possibly non-compliant." Thomas walked past them, squatted beside the small box, and gently brushed away a leaf that had landed on top. "This unit provides broadband for about 60 homes in Elderbrook," he said. "It's not a birdhouse, it's infrastructure." The two men exchanged glances, mumbled something about just following directives, and made a quiet retreat down the sidewalk. Thomas stood in silence for a moment. Then he walked briskly back inside, grabbed his phone, and tapped a contact labeled *Field Ops Josh Knight *. As the line rang, he stepped toward his monitoring console and watched the lights flicker. Just a faint stutter. He didn't like it. When Josh picked up, Thomas didn't bother with pleasantries. "Run a live test on Sector B. Something tells me it's already begun." Thomas wakes to flashing red lights on his diagnostic panel, and no internet. His neighbor, Mrs. Cranston, is on his porch, panicked. "My heart monitor won't sync." He reached the front door still in slippers, pushing it open to find her standing with trembling hands and watery eyes. Her robe hung loose, patterned with faded roses, and she clutched a portable heart monitor to her chest like it might float away. "I've tried 4 times, she said, voice cracking. "It won't send the reading to Dr. Liu, keeps saying connection error. What if something's wrong and they don't get the alert?" Thomas offered a steady hand on her elbow and gently ushered her into the house. "Come in, sit down for a moment. I'll call the clinic if needed." While she settled into the living room, Thomas stepped into his small home office where the quiet hum of equipment had been replaced by something far more ominous: silence. The indicator lights on the central router blinked an angry red. The backup array, usually steady as a heartbeat, flashed intermittently. He tapped a few keys on the console. No signal. Sector B was completely offline, not a slowdown, a full blackout. He didn't need to check the logs to know something was very wrong. Thomas turned back to Mrs. Cranston, who sat fidgeting with the blanket he'd offered her. "I'll set up a mobile hotspot," he said. "You'll be able to send your data from here." Her smile was thin but grateful. "You always know what to do, Thomas." He offered a nod, though his mind was already spinning in a different direction. When she left half an hour later, heartbeat transmitted and some color back in her cheeks, he went outside to inspect the box. What he found made his stomach tighten. The main fiber line had been clipped, cleanly. The casing was still locked, but the weather seal had been forced open. Edges pried like someone had wedged a screwdriver underneath. There were fresh tire tracks near the curb and bits of mulch scattered onto the sidewalk. It wasn't some squirrel chewing wires. This was deliberate. He took several photos, then called Josh, his technician. "I'm looking at a clean sever. Line's dead. Someone popped the seal too." Josh whistled on the other end. "That's not lawn care." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's not." He drove straight to the HOA office. The converted bungalow on Willow Street looked the same as always. Fresh coat of neutral beige, potted mums by the steps, and the flag of Elderbrook fluttering beside the stars and stripes. Inside, the air smelled of toner and burnt coffee. Richard sat at the desk, poring over spreadsheets. Thomas placed a manila envelope on the counter between them. "Your people cut a live fiber line this morning," he said calmly. "Knocked out access to over 50 homes." Richard blinked at him, then slowly picked up the envelope and began flipping through the photos. "I wasn't informed," he murmured. "Your maintenance crew was on my street yesterday afternoon." "That's routine pre-holiday trimming. Karen said—" He stopped himself. Thomas's tone didn't rise, but it chilled. "Karen said what?" Richard scratched at his temple. "She mentioned there were visual obstructions near the road, that some homeowners were pushing the aesthetic guidelines." Thomas tapped the envelope. "That's not aesthetics. That's sabotage." "I'm sure it wasn't intentional," Richard said, his voice too quick. "Probably a miscommunication. Maintenance guys might have thought—" "The line was cut below the utility mark, deliberate, locked casing forced open." Richard's face went pale. He looked at the door to his left, the one leading to Karen's office. It stayed closed. "I'll bring it up," he said too softly. "Do that?" Thomas replied. By the time he returned home, his voicemail had filled with frustrated calls. Mrs. Cranston again, asking if the connection was stable yet. Leon, the high school history teacher, 3 students had called to say they couldn't turn in their projects due that morning. Frank and Lillian down the street, no video call with their grandkids in Oregon because the app wouldn't load. Thomas walked into his office and sat at the console. The backup uplinks Josh had installed were working, but slow and localized. There wasn't enough bandwidth to reroute the whole sector. He reached into his file drawer and pulled out the contract, the one his father had signed with the city over a decade ago, and which Thomas had quietly renewed each year since. Heartland Broadband held exclusive rights to provide internet to Elderbrook. Under Clause 4C, it was clear no organization, including homeowners associations, had jurisdiction over the placement or maintenance of the system. He scanned it again, slower this time, checking the fine print. It was ironclad. He picked up his phone, intending to text Josh, but paused when a message pinged in. Unknown number. He opened it. You'll think twice before hiding tech toys in plain sight again. No signature, no emoji, just that sentence. But it didn't need a name. Thomas stared at it, then slowly placed the phone face down on the desk. Behind him, the router blinked red again. In the quiet, he heard the distant sound of a weed trimmer firing up somewhere in the neighborhood, and suddenly it reminded him of that time, years ago, when Karen had declared wind chimes too disruptive and yanked them from a neighbor's porch herself. She called it noise pollution. But Thomas had always known it was about control. He stood and walked to the kitchen, poured fresh coffee into a chip diner mug, and gazed out the window. They weren't just trimming hedges anymore. They were cutting lifelines. A young local journalist knocks on Thomas's door. Are you really the man behind Heartland Broadband? Thomas opened the door slowly, adjusting his glasses to get a clearer look. The young woman standing on his porch had a notepad tucked under one arm, a phone in her free hand, and a badge clipped to her satchel that read Lily Tran, Elderbrook Times. She offered a nervous smile. Mr. Bellamy, I'm sorry to drop in unannounced. I've been digging into the fiber outage situation and, well, multiple sources say you're not just a neighbor with some tech skills. You own the entire network. Is that true? Thomas studied her for a moment, then motioned toward the bench swing. Come sit. I'll give you a few minutes. Inside, he poured coffee and brought out two mismatched mugs, setting one gently in front of her. The swing creaked as they settled in. Across the yard, the late August sun had begun to soften behind the trees, casting long shadows across the garden beds. I try not to advertise it, he said simply. But yes, Heartland Broadband is my company. My father started it when this town couldn't convince any of the big providers to come out here. I kept it going when he passed, quietly. Lily nodded, scribbling in shorthand. So, you're the reason Elderbrook even has consistent internet? More or less, he said. It's not fancy, but it works. Why keep it secret? Thomas looked out at the yard. People behave differently when they think you have power. It gets noisy. She paused. So, what happens now? You've got legal ground to stand on, right? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the shed where the backup batteries hummed faintly behind insulated walls. I'd appreciate it if you held this story for a week. There are steps I need to take. Quiet ones. Lily blinked. You want me to sit on this? Just for a little while. Let things move without the spotlight. I promise it won't be boring. She nodded slowly. All right, but after a week, off the record or not, it's a great story. After she left, Thomas returned to his study. The room smelled of old pine and electronics. On the wall above his desk hung a framed photo of his father in a brown telephone company uniform, smiling under a pole-mounted switchboard. Next to it was a shadow box containing a pair of antique lineman pliers, the kind that had once strung copper wire through this very town. He sat at the desk and opened the file folder containing the Heartland service contract. The HOA's violation was clear. The clause on obstruction of service infrastructure was precise. He drafted a cease and desist letter, citing specific code and referencing the damaged node and line as a breach. As the printer whirred to life, Thomas leaned back in his chair. The ink drying on the paper felt heavier than its weight. He placed the document into an envelope, sealed it, and set it on the credenza beside the door. The next day at the HOA's weekly meeting, the energy was off from the start. Karen stood at the front of the community room, her tablet in hand, tapping it every few seconds like punctuation to her commentary. Yes, there was a temporary lapse in connectivity, but I've spoken to our service coordinator, and everything is back on track, likely a minor network hiccup. These things happen. Murmurs floated around the room. Some nodded, others looked skeptical. Thomas sat in the back, silent. Karen continued. Now, moving forward, we do need to discuss fines. One resident, Mr. Bellamy, has an unpermitted device structure on his lawn and did not notify the HOA about installation. That's a violation of Section 7C in our guidelines. Thomas raised a hand but didn't speak. Karen gave him the floor. Yes? He stood. Just to clarify, are you accusing me of violating aesthetic rules by maintaining protected infrastructure? Karen's smile was thin. The HOA was unaware of the nature of your setup, and until now, it's been undocumented. Thomas nodded slowly, then took the envelope from his coat pocket and walked it up to the podium. He placed it in front of Richard, who looked up at him, confused. What is this? Richard asked. Cease and desist, Thomas said. Legal grounds. The HOA has violated a binding infrastructure contract with the city. Any further action against Heartland's installations will be considered unlawful interference with a public utility. Karen stepped forward. That's absurd. This is a residential neighborhood. Thomas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Richard. The contract's binding. It's been active for over a decade. Elderbrook's internet isn't run by a faceless company. It's me, and I've let that fact slide for years. Maybe I shouldn't have. Karen leaned in, voice sharp. You're bluffing. Thomas turned, stepping down from the podium. We'll see what the town thinks when the screens go dark. At 7 a.m., phones in Elderbrook buzz with frustration. Video calls lagging, Zoom crashing, banking apps stalling. The town is feeling it. Thomas sipped his morning coffee in silence as the dashboard on his screen confirmed the expected numbers. Bandwidth to the town throttled by 10%. Sector B showed packet loss climbing. Ping times tripled. It wasn't chaos, yet, but the strain was building. He clicked a tab and watched service logs refresh in real time. The system was stable, just slower. Purposefully so. Outside his window, Elderbrook stirred as it always did on a Thursday. Lawns were being watered, kids packed backpacks, and sprinklers hissed in half-moon arcs across sidewalks. But inside homes, the internet chugged like an old lawnmower. 2 blocks away, Frank and Lillian leaned over a tablet at their kitchen table, frustration written across their faces. It won't load, Lillian said, tapping the screen again. I need to renew my prescription. I can't let it lapse again, Frank. Frank shook his head. Try it on my phone. Maybe it's just the app. Already did. Same message? Cannot connect to server. At the Evergreen Diner, the usual crowd sat clustered by the window, staring down at flickering phones. It's like 2002 again, one of them muttered, pushing away his plate. I asked my grandson to send me his graduation photos. Took 5 minutes to open the email, and then it just froze. Francine, holding a fresh pot of coffee, raised an eyebrow. Thomas hasn't been in today. Usually he's got his paper folded and his mug ready by now. He probably can't load the weather report, someone joked, though the tone was clipped. Meanwhile, at the HOA office, Karen stood behind her desk, tapping at her tablet with growing irritation. She closed one app, reopened it, nothing. Richard sat at the nearby table, sorting papers. Still having trouble? It's not just me, Karen said. I've had 4 emails bounce and my banking app won't even load. This is beyond annoying. She composed a short statement and sent it through the HOA's mailing list. Due to unforeseen technical issues beyond the HOA's control, you may experience intermittent internet disruptions. Please refrain from spreading misinformation. We assure you the issue is temporary. She leaned back and exhaled sharply. Let's see Bellamy deny this isn't just a tech hiccup. Richard didn't respond. He was reading a forwarded message from Martha Green, a reply to the HOA chain that Karen had sent. A hiccup? We severed infrastructure and never took responsibility. Now we're blaming the storm when we're the ones who knocked over the tree. You don't just cut the line, Karen. You cut trust. Karen read it over his shoulder, lips tightening. That woman's dramatic flair belongs in theater, not community governance, she muttered. By early afternoon, complaints poured in. Leon, the local history teacher, posted to the neighborhood forum. Students couldn't submit midterm essays today. The school portal timed out all morning. This isn't a minor issue. It's impacting grades. Someone else added, the church livestream froze during Pastor Dale's sermon. My mother had to call me just to ask what hymn they were on. A spontaneous thread exploded online with the title, "Who Controls Elderbrook's Internet?" Some suspected a larger outage. Others quietly guessed that Thomas had finally had enough. In his study, Thomas monitored the forum from a separate console. The public narrative was shifting. He wasn't cheering. This wasn't revenge. It was demonstration. Every dropped call, every frozen video feed was a blinking neon sign that said, "This matters." At sundown, a few neighbors gathered outside town hall, murmuring among themselves. The crowd grew by word of mouth. No official organizer, no flyer, just shared frustration. By 6, nearly 60 people stood at the steps, holding handmade signs. One read, "Fix the line." Another, more direct, "Give back our internet." Karen arrived 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 HOA board members. She tried to greet the crowd with a forced smile, but the reception was icy. Boos rose. A few shouts cut through. "You cut the line! This isn't just about Wi-Fi, it's about trust. Why haven't you apologized?" Martha Green emerged from the side, clipboard in hand, walking calmly to the edge of the crowd. She raised a hand. "Folks," she said, "we're not here to burn anything down, but we are here because something important got ignored, and now we're all paying for it." Karen approached the makeshift podium, an old bench dragged from the sidewalk planter, and leaned in toward Richard. "This is getting out of hand," she hissed. "He won't really shut it all down." Richard glanced out at the growing crowd, the frustration in their faces, the loss of patience in their voices. "You sure?" he said. Karen's house is locked up tight. From behind the blinds, she watches a small crowd gather outside, holding signs. The blinds trembled slightly as her fingers pinched them open. Across the street, 3 neighbors stood beside a handwritten banner duct taped to a patio railing. "Reconnect Elderbrook." One woman held her phone high, clearly filming. Another clutched a sign that read, "This is not a drill." Karen let the slats fall back into place and stepped away from the window. Her living room was dim, curtains drawn, the TV frozen mid-buffer on a local news channel. The spinning wheel had been turning for minutes now. She clicked the remote again, uselessly. Her phone buzzed. An alert. Elderbrook HOA hotline. 73 missed calls. She dropped into her armchair and scrolled through the inbox. Subject lines piled up like storm warnings. Unable to access bank. School portal failure. Medical appointment lost. Thomas had done it. Phase 2. The bandwidth throttled by 50%. Across town, in the quiet of his living room, Thomas sat in a worn leather chair, mug in hand. The interface on his laptop pulsed steadily. He had kept his promise. A structured reduction, no full blackout, yet. But the effects were everywhere. He could see the impact clearly, not just in numbers, but in voices. A group chat of residents buzzed with screenshots, workarounds, frustrations. There were questions, yes, but also realizations. People were starting to connect dots. Richard sat at the HOA office, hunched over a legal binder nearly 3 inches thick. Sweat formed at his collar as he flipped through laminated pages of bylaws. His finger landed on a clause he had read before, but never paid attention to. Emergency Maintenance Protocols, Section 4.2.1. He read it twice, then again. Karen had no authority to order removal of infrastructure, especially utilities recognized under the city's shared service charter. He leaned back, rubbed his temples, then picked up his phone. "Martha," he said, "we need to talk." By late afternoon, an emergency session was scheduled. The meeting took place in the small chamber attached to the town library, a space typically used for quilt clubs and genealogy lectures. But tonight, it was standing room only. A group of tech-savvy high schoolers had volunteered to set up a live stream, patching the feed into Facebook, YouTube, and even a Zoom link. 2 of them wore hoodies with Elderbrook Robotics stitched on the sleeve. Their camera tripod rested on top of an overturned recycling bin. Martha Green sat at the center of the long, folding table, shoulders square, voice calm. "Tonight's agenda," she began, "is to address the handling of recent network disruptions and to revisit the HOA's compliance with city infrastructure law." The stream picked up her every word. Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly. She wore her HOA pin like armor, but even from the camera feed, her expression seemed frayed. Martha continued, "We've received footage, time-stamped and submitted anonymously, showing Ms. Holloway directing groundskeepers to remove an unmarked structure on private property. That structure, we now understand, was the central fiber node for Heartland Broadband." Gasps moved through the room. The stream lit up with comments. Karen stepped forward. "That footage is out of context. I never authorized destruction. I was merely pointing out a non-aesthetic installation." Martha held up the printed images, Karen standing beside the node, pointing at it, speaking to workers, clipboard in hand. "You labeled this aesthetic hazard in the HOA thread. It is one." "No," Martha said. "It's not. It's federally protected infrastructure." Richard cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws." Karen exceeded her authority. There was no vote, no permit request, no city consultation. Karen's voice rose. "This is character assassination." Martha didn't flinch. "This is accountability." Karen's jaw tensed. "You're making a mistake." Before she could speak again, Martha addressed the room. "I motion to remove Ms. Holloway from her position as HOA president and bar her from future leadership roles within the association, effective immediately." A murmur rose. Then one by one, hands went up. 5 votes. 1 dissent, Karen herself. Motion carried. Karen stepped back from the table, face flushed. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door. A few in the audience began to clap, tentative but building. She paused at the exit, looked over her shoulder, and hissed to no one in particular, "He'll regret humiliating me." Across town, Thomas watched the stream from his couch. The camera panned wide, showing the final vote and Karen's exit. The chat exploded in reactions. He leaned forward, muting the volume, and whispered to the empty room, "That wasn't humiliation, that was bandwidth." Labor Day arrives. The park is full of laughter, lemonade, and live music again. And this year, it's fully streamed online. Under the shade of an old sycamore tree, folding chairs creaked with the gentle shifts of older neighbors sipping iced tea and watching their grandkids chase one another between picnic blankets. A band played classic rock from a temporary stage near the gazebo, and above the music floated the subtle ping of live stream notifications from phones and tablets across the lawn. The park's new Wi-Fi boosters blinked steadily in the background, small gray columns mounted on lampposts, blending into the setting like they'd always belonged. Thomas Bellamy stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the scene with quiet contentment. A child tugged on his father's shirt, pointing to a large screen showing the stage feed. "Look, Daddy, it's working now." The father nodded and smiled. Just a few weeks earlier, that sentence would have been wishful thinking. At the end of the long picnic table lined with pies and potato salad, Martha greeted residents with her usual poise. Her first open-door HOA forum had been set under a white canopy near the splash pad. A chalkboard beside her read, "No microphones, just voices." People came and went freely, some with questions, others with ideas, and a few with quiet apologies. There were no clipboards, no formal complaints, just neighbors talking like neighbors. Across town, Karen Holloway's house sat unusually quiet. The blinds remained closed, the porch plants wilted. A modest "for sale" sign had been staked into the front yard, and beneath it, a smaller tag read, "High-speed internet included." No one saw her leave. One morning, a moving van showed up. By noon, the driveway was empty. Back at the park, Francine appeared beside Thomas with a small gift bag. "Told myself I wouldn't get sentimental," she said. "But you earned this?" Inside was a ceramic diner mug, navy blue with white lettering. Local legend, "Don't cross his wire." Thomas chuckled. "That's dramatic. You're the one who brought back bingo night streaming and restored my online recipe blog. I say it fits." He raised the mug slightly in a mock toast to uninterrupted scones and sitcoms. Later that evening, as the picnic wrapped and folding chairs were packed away, Thomas walked home under a fading sunset. The warm air buzzed with the distant hum of crickets. He stepped into his backyard, where the technician team was finishing up the last round of signal checks. "Upload's holding steady," one of them said, tapping his tablet. "Mesh net solid. You sure you're done being the quiet hero?" Thomas leaned against the porch post, cradling his new mug. The smell of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. He watched a boy on the next street over video chat with someone on a porch screen, probably a grandparent, judging by the slow, loving smile across the call. Thomas sipped his coffee. Depends who cuts the next wire. The quiet hum of Elderbrook's network had returned, but something deeper had been restored too: trust, connection, and a sense that every voice mattered. What began as a silent act of defiance became a reminder that even the smallest utility box can anchor a community when it's defended with quiet strength. Sometimes standing firm isn't about shouting louder. It's about knowing when to flip the right switch. Like old fence posts that weather every storm, the roots of justice hold strongest when they run through neighbors who care,